Ready to do this thing?
Let's do this thing.
All right. Well, we're
rolling.
See the red?
Sweet.
Red means on.
Cool.
All right. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Nut Up Show. This is a podcast where we get together, myself and my beautiful wife, Andrea, and we talk about what it is in life that we're doing to basically live the best life possible.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of what Nut Up is all about.
Yeah.
Just shut up and
Nut
do
up.
what you need to do to get to where you want to go.
Exactly.
And a big part of where we want to go is to have, I don't know, this maybe sound a little cheesy, but to get like total mastery and dominance of our own like health and wellness, right? Like it's a big thing, is take care of our health.
Yeah.
Now, I know for me personally, it's something that I struggle a lot with. I am very up and down, very roller coaster-y, especially if you've been following us for a few years.
Yeah.
When I'm doing really well, I'm doing really well. When I'm doing really poorly, I'm doing really poorly. And what I mean by that is I could lose a lot of weight very quickly, and I could also gain a lot of weight very quickly. Not muscle, bad fat weight. So what's really important for us is taking care of health and taking care of, I guess, like medicine, right? We're talking about like the whole medical system.
Yeah.
And so I think what we want to talk about today, this is what we want to talk about today, is some part of that whole system. It's just kind of the overall health care system and how kind of things work. And I think there's kind of two parts to that. There's the health that we do for ourselves to take care of ourselves. But then it's like, what do you do after, you have to go see a doctor for whatever reason, and then the healthcare system. And there's lots of moving parts that go into that healthcare system. And most notably is like medications and different forms of medicines and treatments, right?
Can I focus this even a little bit?
Oh, yeah, no, of course.
So I think part of Nut Up as well for me is always increasing my knowledge base.
Right.
So I read a ridiculous amount and I mostly read nonfiction books because it just increases my knowledge base for things. And I just am a really curious person. And so that's
That's why I call you Whiskers.
Yeah.
Curious like a cat.
Just like a cat. So that's one big thing for me. And then, so added to this, you're starting to talk about the medical side of it.
Yep.
And so I think a really big piece of that I've had to deal with mostly is being an advocate for my health and for the kids' health. And you can't be an effective advocate unless you have knowledge. Right. So that piece is really important, just to put a finer point on what you're trying to say. Yep. So to that point, the book that we're going to talk about today is called Bottle of Lies, and it's about the generic drug industry. And again, having some knowledge about how drugs are developed and what the industry itself looks like, how things are manufactured, I think is really important. If you are required, if you need to go on medication, I think it's really important you know where your drugs are coming from.
Right.
So
yeah, and just what's involved in that. And like for me, and I think for most people, if we have like no idea where drugs come from, I mean, you go to your doctor and they prescribe you something and you just assume that they're prescribing something that is the best for you. And I'm sure doctors have the best intentions or what have you, but it's very interesting to find out exactly, like, I don't know, the politics or the corporations and the money and the whole process behind how drugs are developed. It's kind of eye-opening. And it kind of will make you think twice. I don't know, because it's like, what do you do? But anyways.
Well, I think what's interesting is, so when I was in high school, I did my co-op term was at an actual pharmacy. So I worked with a pharmacist. And so I had always wanted to be a doctor, but then when I worked in the pharmacy, I fell in love with pharmacy. And then I wanted to go and be a pharmacist. However,
I wanted to be Walter White, and just for whatever reason, I love chemistry. Maybe.
So, however, calculus was my Achilles heel. And so that, because I failed out of calculus, that precluded me from moving forward. I should have stuck with it.
This is the easiest subject.
Anyways, I didn't, but I've always had an interest in pharmacy. And so back in 2018, I actually got a job as a pharmacy assistant at Shoppers, and I was there for 7 or 9 months, something like that. Anyways,
7 or 8 or 9 months. Yeah, a little while.
Literally, it was like my favorite job I've ever had because I learned so much, and it was just, it's so fascinating, the world of drugs. And not only that, but you see not just the medications, but the interactions between the pharmacists and the doctors, which is very interesting and
very eye-opening.
and really scary at times.
Yeah. And I also when I was at the University of Waterloo, I played hockey on a team of all the pharmacy students.
Yes.
So these are people that are doing I don't know if it's like a PhD or whatever the degree is, but it's like they become a doctor, right? Basically.
No.
Oh, no. You're right. It's just a master's of pharmacy. What's the actual degree card?
It's just pharmacy.
It's just pharmacy, but it's 4 years anyway. It's just
Yes.
like a med school would be 4 years.
Yep.
And this is 4 years after your undergrad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyways, it's anyways, it was just funny listening to them talking about the whole industry and about doctors and doing prescriptions. But anyways, we'll probably get into that in a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think we should start off. So I guess the basis of this podcast is really just to give everyone an idea of just kind of where drugs come from and the kind of the whole process. So, and you're talking about generic drugs. So maybe we can spend just a minute here talking about how drugs are manufactured, because you basically have your actual drug, which is your name brand drug. Was there a term for that?
Brand.
Yeah. So you have your brand drugs, which is like your Viagra. Like Viagra would be the brand name, right? And then there's the generic version, which is basically like
and then
your
it has
no-name product.
Yeah. So, and it has its actual kind of chemical name. And so for Viagra, the chemical name I think is, I'm going to say it wrong, sildenafil or something like that, but it's something like that. And so the one I actually do know how to pronounce is the best-selling drug of all time, which is Lipitor, which is a cholesterol-lowering drug, which a lot of older people are on. So Lipitor is the brand name. And then I think pretty sure it's made by Pfizer. And then the generic name is called atorvastatin. It's a statin drug. So that's the two differences there.
So it's like brand is like the Nike, the Adidas or whatever. And then the generic is like whatever kind of company that just kind of copies what they do and sells it as like.
Well, I think a better example would be like Pepsi versus like the no-name brand, like no-name cola that you would buy at the grocery store. So that's a difference. And they're the same, but there's like a little bit of a difference when you drink it, right?
Exactly.
It's not 100%.
And for a pop, that might not be a big deal. But for a drug that's supposed to be life-saving, maybe it is a little bit of a big deal, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
Okay, so
but the thing to know about this is that most government health programs and most charitable health programs like Doctors Without Borders, they rely on the generic drug industry because the other brand name, it's unaffordable for those places. And so most insurance companies, if there's a generic drug available, that's what they cover. They will not cover the brand name unless you have a note from your doctor saying
that it has to be that
brand.
one.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very, very important to note, because I don't know what the price difference is. I guess it depends on the drug, but basically a brand name is a huge amount difference, right? Like 4, 5, 10 times the amount. Like it could end up being significant. Again, I think it depends on the drug.
There was, when we had to get one medication for Maya, the difference between the brand and the generic was about $50.
$50, but at what percentage difference though? I guess that's the key.
Yeah.
But I think one was like, would have been $10, and then the brand was like $50 or $60 or something like that, right? So it's significant. It's a significant difference, right? It's like doubling, tripling, whatever the actual price.
Yeah. Well, you can even go and see if you buy, generic ibuprofen compared to actual Advil, the brand Advil. They're the same medication, but there's a difference in price. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. And some people swear by them. It's like, I only want the brand or whatever. That's a whole another issue. What you're good for.
We'll get into that. Yeah.
For the commercial aspect. Yeah. Okay. So where do you want to start off in terms of talking about?
Let's just start off number one. So I heard about this book. Dr. Peter Attia has a really great podcast called The Drive. And he had this Catherine Eban, who is the author of this book on. She's an investigative journalist. She's written another book before this. She writes for Vanity Fair. She's an amazing, amazing author and writer.
Or journalist.
Journalist, yes. And so that's where I first heard, because I listened to his podcast. He has an amazing podcast. And so that's where I first heard that interview. And then so, of course, I had to pick up the book because this story could be like a thriller movie. Like it could be like how the stuff that happens.
It's so crazy that you wouldn't think it's actually real life. You
can't even believe it's real life. So that's why I started reading the book. So I think the best way to start this is to talk about how the whole drug development works, because we need to have a background on the difference between
brand versus generic
and why there is that big difference in cost.
Okay. So how does a brand name drug get developed?
The drug development process is a really long process that can take years, if not decades, to bring a drug to market, and billions of dollars. Or in the case of
a pandemic, it could take
18 months.
18 months. Well, even less than that.
Yeah.
But we won't talk about that because that's a whole nother story.
So anyways, and close to like $1 billion. And so what you start with is you start with a molecule that you want to investigate. You want to see if this molecule has a therapeutic use, right? Does it help something, or does it have some sort of effect? So the first thing you do is you look at this. These are called the preclinical trials, or preclinical research, where you're just looking at it in a petri dish and just tissue.
It's just heavy science.
Heavy R&D. Science, yeah. And you're just looking, what does it do? What is it doing, kind of thing. So then you take that and you test it on animals.
But is it even before then, when you're doing this investigation of a molecule, do you already have a hypothesis saying like, I think this molecule will be good at helping?
Yes.
Alleviate X.
So probably based on its chemical structure and maybe what it looks similar to, you would probably have an idea of what it is. Because, for example, there's many different statins on the market, and
What's a statin?
So a statin is a cholesterol lowering drug, and so there's all kinds of different statins. Lipitor is a torvastatin. I forget the other names, but there's a bunch of them. So they look chemically similar and they act chemically similar, but there are differences, therapeutic differences to it. So
how your body reacts to it or whatever.
Yeah. So you probably have some idea of what this chemical is going to do.
Okay. Yeah. So okay.
Yeah.
So you do a bunch of research to figure out how it could potentially interact inside an organism's body or whatever. Yeah.
So then,
or an animal, I guess.
So then you take that from the petri dish, and then you put it in like an animal. So whatever model animal you're using, usually
like puppies. Fuck. Anyway, sorry, I'm totally derailing things.
Yeah. So, and the reason is because you want to see how it works, not just in the petri dish, but like in a complex system, right?
Yep.
So you do that. Does it work?
Or an actual live organism.
Yeah. So like, does it work? Is it safe? At what point does it become toxic? This is all the preclinical work. So once you've kind of figured out maybe like a dosage that might be okay, and it's not going to kill someone.
That supposedly does what it's supposed to do as well.
Then you move into clinical trials, which is where you test on humans. That's when you hear clinical trials, think human testing. That's the point that they're at. So there's 4 different phases of
a clinical trial.
Of clinical trials. For each point, they add more. For each phase, there's more people that you're testing in each phase. And I won't go through it. We'll put a link to it. The FDA actually has a really good kind of infographic to show what each phase does. But basically, in each of these phases, they're looking for safety. They're looking for efficacy. Is this drug doing what it's supposed to do? And is it doing it well? They're looking to see what's the optimal dosage. And they're looking to see, is there any adverse events, and what are kind of the side effects of it? So those are the 4 clinical trials. Once it gets through phase 4, then they submit all of their data from everything to the FDA. The FDA takes however long it needs to take to look over this, look at all of the different data from all of the different studies, and then it gets approved as a drug to use. So, and then
approved, and then the company can go ahead and mass produce this and sell it.
Yes. So, but this is the other thing that the company also has to prove, is that they can mass produce it, and that it will be 100% consistent across the board. There's a little variability that they allow, but not much, obviously.
It's got to be basically chemically pure pill that they can produce or
as
whatever.
You ramp up how much you're making, right? So, and then after that, after it's approved and the company is selling it, there's still monitoring. FDA.
You got to have long-term studies, of course.
So you have to make sure they have to submit data once a year to show how things are going. They have to submit data to show every 3, 6, 12, 9 months how the drug is not decomposing, but basically stability data. That's what I'm looking for, stability data. And so not only that,
in terms of the drug sitting on the shelf or what have you?
Yes, exactly. And so then and then also the manufacturing plants have to be inspected as well to make sure that they're not dirty and disgusting.
So a lot of questions here. Yeah. We don't want to go out too much into the weeds here. But the first question I have is the person that's responsible for giving all the safety data and the data that, oh, this is good. And all the information about how it's being used, even after they pass phase 4 and they're in production, all of that data is being provided by the company.
Yes.
So we're just all assuming that in good faith, the company is providing this accurate information that is true. Like they're not basically saying the drug is safer than it actually is.
Yes. So I don't know. I mean, this is really getting into the weeds. I don't know if I'm sure they must pair with, or they must work with some public academic institutions. I don't know that they do though. If it's all just done in-house privately, I don't know.
Right. And how are they maintaining these long-term studies as well too? Like, oh, this drug came out 10 years ago. How are our doctors, every time there's an adverse effect with their patient, are they reporting it somewhere or something? I don't know. But that's not, I guess that's beyond of where we want to go at this point.
Yeah.
Because we're not thinking big conspiracy theory here on whatever, but that's not the point. But it's just to see that.
Yeah.
What is the process like?
So that's the process. And so while this is happening, while this drug is being developed, the drug company's lawyers are, and then to use her words, are building a fortress of patents around this drug. So they're not just patenting the molecule itself that they've found. They're patenting every single step in the manufacture of this drug. So say it has like 5 different steps, they're going to patent each of those manufacturing steps. Then they're going to patent its delivery, its mode of delivery, and they're going to patent if it has a time release, they're going to patent that as well. So
and the mode of delivery would be patenting exactly how this pill, for example, would break down in the body. So like, after 2 hours, this portion is going to get digested. So these chemicals are going to get delivered and whatever, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So every single step everything is patented so that it protects them and it protects their $1 billion investment, right? So that when it goes to market, then it's patented and they're the only ones that can sell it. And you can't blame them. If you're investing this much money, you need to make a profit. Right.
Well, I mean, I think of it almost as like the copyright laws that we have. I mean, if I create a song, I want to be able to sing the song and sell it without anybody stealing it.
Same idea. So not only that, so that's the one thing that it's protected by is the patent. Then on top of this, within the FDA, you have what's called exclusivity rights. So the exclusivity, so patents last for 20 years. But patents, so say you're at the beginning of your drug development, and so say you patent that molecule, the patent starts when you file that patent. So even if it's taken you 10 years to officially develop it into a drug,
you only have 10 more years after you goes to market.
Yes. So then the exclusivity rights also help protect you as well, because the exclusivity rights of that company selling that drug can be anywhere from 6 months to 7 years.
After it gets released.
Yep. So then the drug company has 7 years upwards of 7 years to sell that drug exclusively. So they get all of that profit from that. They basically have a monopoly on that drug.
Yeah.
No one else can sell it. So that is the incentive then for the pharmaceutical companies to do research and development.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about that system. Is that somebody develops something, they should be allowed to sell it and be able to make a profit of it. I mean, that fuels and drives innovation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I mean, we don't want to talk about capitalism here in this podcast, but it's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing.
Yeah. So where do the generics fit in this is the question. So for most of the 20th century, there were no generic drug companies, maybe 1 or 2, but not like there are today. And the reason is because in order for a generic drug company to get their same drug as the big brand companies, they would have to go through the exact same drug development process as the brand name.
Right.
And so, but they don't have the incentive of that patent or the exclusivity rights. Right. So there's no way they're never going to make their money.
So if I was going to start a company that's going to manufacture drugs and be like, oh, look, here's a drug Viagra, let me just copy it so I can sell it. It's like, well, wait a minute. I have to spend all this money to do the same research that's already been done.
Yes.
And then yet when I go to sell it, there's already something on the market. So it's already saturated. How am I supposed to make a viable business out of this?
You can't.
Because at the end of the day, things are businesses. I mean, money drives everything, right?
Yeah.
So that's fair, I guess, right?
Yes. So, but as the drugs were becoming more and more in use and people were understanding that like they're so expensive. These drugs are so expensive and you can't afford them. Insurance companies were having issues because the drugs were so expensive. So what happened is in 1984 in the US, they passed what's called
1984.
Yeah. It's called the Hatch-Waxman bill.
Who's they? Who was the president?
So I don't know who it was. Was it
Reagan?
I was going to say Reagan in 84. I have no idea. But anyway, so they passed this bill, the Hatch-Waxman, and basically it allowed generic drug companies to file what's called an abbreviated new drug application. So an ANDA. That's how we would say it, ANDA. And so what that means is that they would have to do, they wouldn't have to do all of like the preclinical, clinical trials. The only thing that this generic drug companies would have to do is just demonstrate that their generic drug uses the same active ingredient and has the same absorption level. So we would call that it's bioequivalent. That's all that they would have to show. They wouldn't have to show anything else. They wouldn't have to put that huge investment and all of those years of doing all of that research. And that's why it's called an abbreviated new drug application, because it's not the full deal. So, and so whatever generic drug company was the first to file this ANDA, then they would get 6 months of exclusive rights to sell that drug. So then it's
as a generic.
As generic. So then you just have the brand name and the second generic. So they're still going to be making more money. And then 6 months later, then the rest of the generics can come online and then drive that cost of the drug even further down.
Right.
So that's how it works. That's how the whole deal works.
Yep. So Ronald Reagan was president in 1984.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I think it was 2 terms. I think that was the start of his second term.
Yeah.
November of 84.
Yeah. So then one of the last pieces to this story is...
Or the process.
No, to the story.
Okay.
are how so generic drugs, they're so ubiquitous. 90% of our drug supply of what people take is generic
nowadays.
Drugs. Yes.
Well, it's cheaper. So I have a question going back to saying how before this, drugs were just so expensive. I mean, is that just because of the fact that every single drug was basically a monopoly and that was the only way to get it? Because like, listen, if this is the only pill that you can take to help you with your heart disease or whatever.
Yes.
I guess you charge whatever you can because you need it to live kind of thing, right?
Exactly. So that's obviously not a good thing. But maybe this is a question for after we go through this whole process, but like, is the way to circumvent that to figure out how generics can get into the game to push down the prices, which in itself, I guess, is not a bad thing if you have more competition, more people creating the same thing. Well,
that's what you just said.
Yeah.
So, but is that the best way, or should there have been some kind of government regulations to put a cap on how much an industry should be able to charge for a drug?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
But the point is like our whole the insurance, everything relies on these cheap generics
nowadays. Well, of course. Why spend more money when you can spend less on something that I guess is what we're told is that it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
So then the point of this book is, so she talks and she goes through obviously in way more detail what we just went through with kind of the background of this. But the point of this, one of the points of the book is she profiles one generic drug company in particular that was particularly egregious in their fraud. And that company's name is Ranbaxy, and it is a company that was their manufacturing plants and their head office is based in India. They're an Indian company. And so the point of this is 40% of our generic drugs are made in India. 80% of all of the active ingredients in brand and generic drugs are made in India and in China. Mm-hmm. So this becomes the point of the book, is that the FDA and Health Canada and other regulatory bodies have to inspect those plants, those manufacturing plants overseas, which becomes an issue. And so from 2002 to 2009, this is like a long time ago now, the number of facilities overseas that required inspection by the FDA and obviously Health Canada skyrocketed from 500 to over 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
They did
3,000 plants that solely produce generic drugs.
Yeah, or active ingredients for
ingredients,
even brand.
okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So then
Active ingredients to produce drugs.
So then you have an issue here because you have all of these plants. There's not enough people. There's no like office, like FDA office over in India, and India and China are huge countries. So how do you get to all these places? How do you get regulators to all of these places to do all these inspections, right? That is what becomes difficult, is the logistics of it. Not only that, here in Canada and the US, if you're going to go inspect some sort of manufacturing plant, if it's a food processing plant, drug, it doesn't matter, whatever it is that Health Canada and FDA are regulating, all of the visits and inspections are unannounced, which is how it should be, right? You want to catch them with their pants down if you can, because that's the point of it. That's not what happens overseas. Overseas, these things are planned months in advance. They have advanced knowledge that the inspectors are going to be coming in. And the reason is because those companies then take care of all the travel arrangements, they take care of visas, they take care of everything for the inspectors. And so these companies know when the inspectors are coming, which is an issue.
So you just went over a lot of different things here,
Yes.
because we kind of just jumped into
Yeah.
how generics and stuff are made to talking about a specific company. So do you want to say, so 1984, this bill is passed, and then all of a sudden companies are realizing that it's profitable to be able to start making generic drugs. And then also they start setting up shop primarily in India and China, I guess.
I think at the beginning because there are generic manufacturing plants. I think like all the other industries, they moved to cheaper labor,
right?
Cheaper things.
So you mean they
overseas.
were like in North America, but then it was like, well, it's much cheaper to produce in other countries.
Yeah. So like I said, from 2000 to 2009, it skyrocketed from 500 to 3,000.
Right. Okay. And who is in charge of setting up these regulations then as to how the inspections work? Because I think the problem is that a lot of these plants don't have the same level of inspection that they do in, say, America or in Canada.
No. I wouldn't say level of inspection. The inspection should be the same, right? Across the board. You're talking about manufacturing practices.
Well, that's what I mean. Well, you're saying because they go in to inspect. And like you said, here in North America, it's unannounced. But in other parts of the world, it's not like that. So like, why is there that difference?
So because of travel logistics was one of their things. The other things was there's lots of politics at play. And so a couple of things she talked about were there was times where they wanted to do an unannounced visit, but they were like, no, you can't. We're trying to work with this country to make this agreement with this country. And if you go in and shut this plant down, then it's going to fuck everything up. So they're not wanting it to be, an international incident or something when they're trying to do something else with that country.
Right. Okay.
So that's part of it as well.
So basically, I guess we're setting the stage up is that there's a lot of manufacturing plants that are producing drugs or chemicals that create drugs in India and in China. And the FDA and other regulatory bodies don't have the same authority or capacity to be able to do, I would say, the level of inspections that you would want to have in something as important as manufacturing of drugs. Yes. So I guess that sets the stage up for this little story, I guess, from this one company that is particularly bad in terms of how a company could circumvent this whole process of, we have 2 months before someone comes and inspects us, so maybe we can hide a few things.
Go to the shredder.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's see where this goes.
Okay. So then we'll go into the story of Ranbaxy and how things kind of happened at this company. Just so it's a great case study to know like how egregious and how ridiculous things can become. So there was this company executive who worked at Bristol Myers Squibb, and his name, which is a brand name drug company in New Jersey, I think it was New Jersey, and his last name was Thacker. And so he worked at this company. He's Indian himself. He immigrated to the U.S., had U.S. citizenship. So he was working at this like really this company is like
top
level company.
I think every pharmaceutical company is pretty big.
So he's working there, and his colleague or his boss at the time convinces him to go back to India to work at Ranbaxy. He's kind of like, let's bring our knowledge back to our home country and help our home country, build this industry there, because, the Indian, like, pride for your home country, right? Yep. And let's go back and help out. So he ends up going back and works at Ranbaxy with this guy, and he notices like there's a huge difference. There's a huge culture shock for him. Things are just not done the same. Things are in a huge state of disarray at Ranbaxy. Nothing is organized, and that's one of his jobs, is to kind of get each drug portfolio organized and all of these things. That's part of his job. So anyways, his boss ends up, the guy that recruited him is his boss at Ranbaxy, ends up quitting.
Okay.
And he is like, he can't understand why his boss quit and why his boss all of a sudden starts talking really bad about Ranbaxy. And one of the quotes that the guy says to him is, "It was like I was trying to change the tires on a car that was going down the highway." So it's like he was trying to fix something that was so out of control, and he just couldn't fix it. So he quit. So he gets a new boss, and his new boss, his name is Kumar. And Kumar ends up having to go to South Africa to meet with the World Health Organization. And so the reason he's doing this is because Ranbaxy had been given a contract to make generic drugs, generic antiretroviral drugs for AIDS patients in countries in Africa, specifically South Africa. So this was a United States initiative called PEPFAR. People might remember hearing about this. It was George W. Bush that started this PEPFAR, and it was called stands for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So they were contracting out generic drug companies to make super cheap AIDS drugs to help with the AIDS epidemic. That was the point of it. Ranbaxy,
not a bad cause.
Not a bad cause at all. Ranbaxy gets a contract to do this. So then PEPFAR contracts out the WHO to be the inspectors and the regulators of this initiative.
Yep, fair.
So Thacker goes to South Africa to meet with these WHO regulators, and he steps into a shitstorm because the WHO is just like, there's these clinical tests that you did. There's no patients that exist for these clinical tests. So you've made up patients to test these drugs on.
So sorry, what do you mean by that?
So the patients that they say they tested these drugs on to make sure that they worked, they made them up. They made up the data.
Oh, right. Okay. So this is after they've already started whatever step in the process they're in. They submitted data, and then he's going to the WHO to just discuss this data that they submitted. Okay.
Yeah. And the WHO is just like, these patients didn't exist.
All right.
The patients that did exist, it looks like they have identical data sets from each patient. It just looks like they photocopied them.
Right.
Not only that, the data of the drug dissolution was completely fabricated. And they're like, you got to fix this, because essentially the drug that you say that you're sending for these AIDS patients, it's untested, essentially. So Kumar is like,
so how did the WHO find out that all this stuff was
I don't know,
falsified?
I don't know. She doesn't get into that too much. But anyways, so on the way, so Kumar's just like dumbstruck. He's like, what the?
But isn't he the boss? Doesn't he?
He came in, like he had literally only been there for a couple months at that company in that position before he had to go to South Africa.
What's his position within the company? Is he like the CEO, or is he just kind of like a sales kind of guy?
Hold on, let me see. So Kumar was the director for research and development.
That sounds pretty high up. So it sounds like you should have your hand in pretty much everything.
Yeah, but like I said, he had just gotten to Ranbaxy.
Right.
Yeah.
But after this other guy left, who was supposedly a decent guy.
So he knew, but that's why he quit, is because he knew what was going on and he couldn't do anything to change it.
Interesting. So, but he's the director. Yeah.
So on his way home from South Africa, this Kumar sitting beside Ranbaxy's director of bioequivalence on the plane. And he's telling him what's happening. And the director tells him, like, yeah, this problem isn't limited to just these drugs. It's like everywhere. So he's like, this Kumar guy's like, what the actual fuck is going on? So he gets back. He knows Thacker is like he can trust him. And he says, you need to get your people together and we need to look at the dossiers on every single drug we have in every single country. And you need to tell me if it's systemic, like we need to know what's going on.
Right.
So Kumar goes and does this. What they found is that the dossiers on each drug submitted to the regulators contain data that did not match.
Each drug for this AIDS initiative or for everything that they produce?
Everything that they produce. So 50 in Europe and in the US, 50 to 60% of the data that they submitted to the regulators wasn't the data that they collected.
50 or 60%.
50 to 60%.
And these are drugs that have been approved and
By
that
the
are actually
FDA.
in circulation
Yes.
and people are buying, like
Yes.
you and I are buying
Yes.
as generic drugs that
Yes.
are
Yes.
supposedly approved.
Yes. And so then 100...
And they're approved on 100% false data
Yeah,
that they made up.
50 to 60% false data in
Right.
the US and in Europe.
Right.
In the rest of the world, especially in the developing countries, it's 100% fabricated.
All the data is fabricated.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And then she says in the book, Ranbaxy's manufacturing standards boiled down to whatever the company could get away with.
So to summarize this, is basically this company was pretty much inventing or making up data for almost everything that they were producing.
Yes.
But why? Is it because the stuff they were producing was garbage and it was actually hurting people? And do you know what I mean?
No, that's not the question. The question that you should be asking is, well, why would they fabricate the data?
Well, that's what I mean,
Yes.
right?
So the
because
reason
the
is
real
because-
data is
Because it's cheaper. It boils down to, it was cheaper for them to use cheaper products, to make the drugs, to not have to do all the tests, to not have to do all the studies. That's why.
so, but it's not because the drugs that they were producing were killing people. It's just that it was cheaper to just not even do it at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because why you said they're doing tests, why not? And they weren't giving the real data; they were giving manufactured data. Why wouldn't they give the real data
Because
if the data was showing that the drug was okay?
Because the data wasn't showing that the drug
That's
was
what I mean. So they were actually producing
Yes.
stuff that was not
Yes.
good, not healthy,
Yes.
wouldn't pass. So they just make up stuff that would make it pass. So they were
Yeah.
voluntarily selling drugs to people that were harmful.
Yeah. So the main example of this is the drug called, I'm going to say it wrong, Stortet, I think is how you say it. Hold on. Sotret.
Sure.
Okay. So this drug is the generic version of Accutane. And so Accutane is an anti-acne oral medication that it's a pill that you take. Mm-hmm. And so this drug is so crazy that it has a black box warning. And so there's a few drugs.
The name brand version.
Any version.
Okay.
It has to have a black box warning because the side effects can be very significant.
Okay.
Because it can, if you take it and you're pregnant, it will cause a miscarriage or birth defects. It causes people to become suicidal. There was actually a case. The reason why it even got a black box designation is because like a senator's son killed himself while he was on it.
Wow.
So it's really serious. So Ranbaxy had a meeting and they knew that there was impurities in their version that they were selling, the generic version. And so they bring in their head guy of kind of manufacturing and they're like, well, how long would it take to fix this? Like, what should we do? And he's like, you need to take all of our product off the shelves. It needs to be recalled. We need to go back and it's going to take like 6 months.
You got to like reformulate the whole thing, right?
They're like, nah, we're just going to leave it. So they had all of the information. They put it in a file and the file said, do not give to the FDA.
Right.
Literally, that's what it says.
Showing like all this guy's analysis of what they needed to do or whatever and his recommendation. And they just shoved it under the rug basically.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyways, so that's probably the best example of what happened. And because there was impurities in it, the dissolution rate wasn't the same.
Right.
Like it was just a big
so
mess.
it would be fair to say that basically this company, at least in particular, it's just a way to cut margins, cut costs, just make as much money as possible without any regard to the ethics of what they were doing, whether they were harming or hurting people, or they're not even in the business of trying to help people. They're just in the business of making money and how you can do it as cheaply as possible and what you can get away with.
Yeah. So, and like, not only that, like they would take the brand name version of the drug and they would just use that as their data to send to the FDA. So they would take that drug and they would put it through whatever tests they needed to do for dissolution, for whatever it was.
Oh, they'd run the tests with the actual brand drug and say like, here's the results.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
do they have to submit any data on the actual drug that they produce and like submit the drugs to say, here's my drug? And then whenever the WHO or whatever is checking it, do they use that drug itself to perform their own tests?
Like the FDA itself? No.
They don't do their own independent testing?
I don't think so. No, they don't. That's the point of this book is they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's why whatever the regulatory bodies has to kind of really look at the data they're sending to make sure that it is legit.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine that's got to be difficult to tell whether someone's putting in legit data or not.
Yeah. Yeah. So then the thing is, just to show how egregious this company is. So Kumar and Thacker, because they're both really ethically, really high moral standards, they created this PowerPoint presentation of all this information that they collected about how awful these drugs were. And they called it the self-assessment report. Mm-hmm. And so they presented it to the board. And
again, this is still internal though.
Yeah, still internal. No, it's at a board meeting. They send the secretary out of the room because the executives know what's coming. So they send the secretary out of the room so there can be no record, no minutes are taken of this meeting. Yeah. And so they showed them this. And so her quote in here is, in its race for profit, Ranbaxy had lied to regulators, falsified data, and endangered patient safety in almost every country where it sold drugs. More than 200 products in more than 40 countries had elements of data that were fabricated to support business needs. That's a lot.
Yep.
And so Kumar's suggestion as he's presenting this is you need to pull all the drugs, inform the regulators, repeat the tests, and just,
that's like going to the police station and admitting to a bunch of crimes so you get locked away.
So
how well did that go?
Yeah. So the board members and the CEOs were just like, can't we just bury this? That's literally what they said. Can't we just bury this? So Kumar resigns. He's like, I can't work if you're not going to change it. No, it was a little later on. He resigned. Thacker actually eventually leaves as well. They tried to force him out because he wouldn't hand over his copy of this self-assessment report. So they tried to pin it on him that he had surfed porn, and he could show like, I didn't surf porn at work. But he was like, I can't work for a company that's going to do this to me. So he leaves as well. Yeah. So yeah.
And then they end up telling their story. Obviously.
And then, so then he ends up, I won't go through it because it's such a long story, but he eventually becomes a whistleblower. The issue is it took the FDA years and years to act on his information. And even once he had sent them the self-assessment report, they had still approved, I think 27, like they knew there was stuff going on. They still approved like 27 different drugs from Ranbaxy.
After this guy told them basically that all their data that they're submitting is lies.
Yeah.
And it's fabricated.
Yeah. So
that's interesting. So, sorry, do you have anything else that you want to say about?
No, if you have questions, go ahead.
The whole question is kind of like, okay, so yes, this is a story of one manufacturing company out of, I don't know how many hundreds of generic companies are out there, thousands maybe. I don't know, you said 3,000 plants or what have you, probably growing even more today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So how should we look at this as a big problem? Like, should there be like warning signs like, hey guys, if one company's doing this, maybe a lot of other companies are doing this? Like, how worried should we be?
We should be worried because then she also talks about a few other people that didn't know about this story as it was happening, but as it was happening, we're also recognizing the same thing. There was a really big issue with people were getting dialysis in many hospitals in the United States. And so when you get dialysis, you get this drug called heparin. Mm-hmm. And heparin, I forget what it is. It's a blood thinner or something like that. And so you just get it when I think it's kidney dialysis. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. But anyways, what they were getting the generic version. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is that people were dying because this heparin was contaminated. And so they finally figured out what company they were using, what company, the brand, whatever.
Where the drug was coming from.
Yeah. And so it was completely just
toxic. Just
disgusting. And so that's why people were dying, was because of it. So the FDA, they still did not take responsibility for what happened to these people. They were up against Congress and everything like that, and they still didn't take responsibility for it. So there was that example. There was a doctor at the Cleveland Clinic. He's a cardiologist. So the Cleveland Clinic is a really prestigious hospital in the States. He's a high-level cardiologist. He actually heard a little bit about, on a podcast on National Public Radio, NPR, and he heard about people having issues with generic drugs. And so then he kind of was thinking about his patients and looking at his patients that weren't doing well, or that were doing well, and then all of a sudden
then they weren't.
And what he eventually created with the pharmacists at the Cleveland Clinic was like their kind of confidential blacklist of generic drugs that they would no longer allow their patients to be prescribed.
Because they probably had a bunch of different correlations they found with people taking this generic was having this issues or whatever.
Every single time there was an issue with someone, because they were dealing with things like heart transplants. And there was one example of a woman, she was taking brand name for to avoid organ failure, like an immune suppressant. And she was put on a generic immunosuppressant. And then she eventually died, and because she had organ failure and organ rejection, and she eventually died.
So, okay, so we should be worried because, I mean, you can say, like, again, we don't know all these plants. There's who knows where, like, whenever I go get a prescription filled out, it's like, do you want the generic one? It's like, yeah, good luck knowing where it's coming from or what have you, or what regulations have been. When you just put your trust in Health Canada to be able to do the right thing, to be able to monitor these drugs. But clearly there can be a lot of conflicts of interest or a lot of things that these companies are doing. So,
go.
Yeah.
Go.
So as an individual, what can we do to take this information? And like, again, not saying like, oh, every generic drug company they're evil and they're all just creating these horrible things. But if some of them are, then you have to be wary. So what can you do to protect yourself, right? Because as I said at the beginning of the podcast, you can protect yourself by being as healthy as you possibly can, taking care of what you eat, how you exercise, whatever. So you totally can minimize your dependency on going to a doctor or going to have to take drugs.
Yeah.
But then when you do have to go to the doctor, you do have to take drugs. How can this information help you make a better decision?
To be honest, how I would take this and how we've approached it, we don't take
you just don't take drugs.
Luckily, there's some people that they just don't have a choice, right? You have to be on a certain medication for whatever condition you have. If you can afford it, I would say go get brand.
That's what I was going to say. To me, it sounds like get the brand name, because those ones have to go through more rigorous processes in order to make sure that it's okay, that it's safe. So
I think the other thing too is, or if, I would even talk to your healthcare provider and say, like, look, I'm really concerned about this. And I read, there's this book out there talking about this, and she's not the only one.
There's more than one book on this.
I'll tell you about this other podcast. But you even can say, is there any way you can write me an exemption kind of thing, so that I can, saying that you only want me on brand, because that's when insurance companies will usually
they have to honor it, because that's what the doctor says.
Yeah.
Right.
So the other thing too is some people can only have brand, because the thing with drugs is with any type of drug, you have the active ingredient, and then you have these other kind of things in it called excipients that help it dissolve in a certain way, or they're just part of it. So generic drug companies will use different excipients than brand companies. And so sometimes you can have an allergic reaction. So you have to take the brand.
And this is what's so mind boggling. Like, if you studied any kind of chemistry, like even if you're off by one atom or electron, your compound can become a completely different thing and do completely different things to your body.
Yeah.
So you're having these brand companies make a drug, And then these generic people, they come and they reverse engineer it.
Yeah.
And yeah, they might have the same ingredients, but even if you have the same ingredients and you combine them in different ways, it's going to have a completely different effect in the body. But yet they're being promoted as the same drug or that they're equivalent when they're often chemically, they can't be. So that's just another thing.
So then let me give you another example of other than this book. So there's a podcast on NPR that one doctor listened to, and it's called The People's Pharmacy. And so it's run by a pharmacist himself and then also his wife, who is a medical anthropologist. And so they've had this is actually how she found out about this issue was they contacted her because they knew she was an investigative journalist and had done stuff within healthcare before. So what they were seeing was people were calling in about it having issues with their generic drugs. And the one big one that she talks about is it's a drug that actually a lot of people will probably be familiar with. It's called Wellbutrin. Wellbutrin is an antidepressant. And so Wellbutrin is the brand name. Bupropion is the generic name. So
Sorry, can I just...
Yeah.
Are there lots of different generic versions of a specific drug? Because you're saying Wellbutane or whatever.
Wellbutrin.
And then you said this other one.
Bupropion.
Are there other generic versions of this Wellbutrin?
Wellbutrin, I don't know specifically about that one.
Aren't there like 20 different companies making the same generic version of...
For Wellbutrin, I don't know. Something like Lipitor, 100%. There's like a bunch of different generic companies making a atorvastatin.
Right.
For sure.
Okay, anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So what they were finding is these people were calling in being like, I'm on the generic version of Wellbutrin and like...
Not doing well.
I'm not doing well. Like people that had never been suicidal were all of a sudden suicidal. Or
even though they were just taking it for depression or whatever.
Or they were having like other crazy symptoms. And so they kept, it wasn't just one or two. Like when do you go from something being anecdotal to becoming actual data, data set, right? And so they had like all of these people, like hundreds of people telling them this. And so they reported this to the FDA. They kept reporting it. The FDA tested it and said, no, that's bioequivalent. I think it was...
Sure, it's bioequivalent, but...
I think it was they eventually found someone to run an independent analysis for them with
this
both.
People's
Pharmacy. Yeah. And so what they found was the Wellbutrin, the time of the drug dissolution within your bloodstream was like a slow, steady slope, right? Yep. Until it hit its peak and then it went down. So it was nice and slow.
Yep.
For the generic version, it was super
huge
fast.
Spike.
Huge spike. So you can't call that bioequivalent, and that's why people were having
completely
problems.
A completely different drug.
So finally, they bring this to the person's attention at the FDA, their contact at the FDA, and eventually I think they do something. I think they figure it out. But what's really interesting about this is their contact for the FDA hemmed and hawed and wouldn't take any action. And then a few months later, this guy leaves to go and work for the generic drug company that made this bupropion.
That made the drug.
Yeah.
So he leaves the FDA because he's like, well,
and he goes and
my
works.
job here's toast.
He works and then he goes to work for that drug company. Mylan is their name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of
fuckery.
It's funny when you talk about this kind of stuff, because I'm sure there's some people that be like, oh, well, you're just talking conspiracy theory, stuff like that. Since when does talking about events that have happened equate to being a conspiracy theorist, right? Like, I'm not saying everything's dire straits and every single company is doing wrong things, but I mean, these are documented cases of things going wrong with life and death medication where people are actually dying. And I don't think it's something that we need to be concerned about.
But I don't even think you need to get to conspiracy. It's just fucking greed. Well, that's what it is.
But that's what I mean. But it's just, I'm just saying, when you talk about things like that and you question, especially stuff with the medical industry, you're questioning this. Oh, well, you think everything's a conspiracy. It's like, whoa, it seems to be lack of nuance in discussion. And it's boiled down to greed and, and the you wouldn't think, like you said at the beginning, that this could be like a movie. It's like the lengths that people go to make money. It's so inhumane. You can't even almost comprehend it. Cause like, why are you willing to kill people literally with your drug just so that you can make money, or because it's easy, or I don't, there's no way I could understand that. So to me, it does seem like a foreign thing where it's like, oh yeah, why would people do that? But it seems to be a lot more prevalent than...
Yeah.
people want to think.
Well, and even the funny part is she talks to this one FDA regulator. This guy is like, he's like a hero investigator for the FDA, and he relates. She tells a story, and it's like a scene from like a Matt Damon movie, where he's walking down the hall of this one drug company in India that he's inspecting, and there's somebody that kind of turns around and sees him, and this guy has like this bag full of something, and so the guy in front of him starts walking, like its worker starts walking faster, and so the guy's like, hey, wait a second. The guy starts walking even faster, so he starts to speed up, and then Buddy just breaks into a full out run. He opens up the door and he heads into this one space, and he throws this bag of whatever it is into the trash bin.
Yeah, I'm going to collect that.
Yeah, and so that's what he does. He jumps in, this regulator jumps in, and that's where he finds all of this fabricated data that they don't want the FDA to see. And it's just like, this is like from a movie. So the two other things that we need to talk about is, it's not, for us, it's one thing here in like a first world country, and we have choices and we have money to spend to buy brand name drugs if we want to.
Are you speaking just you and me, or a lot of people here are struggling, you know? So it's...
Yes, but we're still, it's even the bad generics that we get here are better than what happens in the third world.
Well, like
countries.
you said, at least here, only 50 to 60% are falsified data, not 100%.
Yeah. So what these people do, what some of these generic drug companies do, is they have two tracks of generic drugs, right? They have the ones that they make for the more regulated markets like ours in the United States and Europe.
Because those are the rules and regulations that they need to try to follow.
Yep. And because that's where all the money is, right? For them as well. But then they have their second tier, where is drugs for poor countries.
Yep. Or no one's monitoring, or there's very loose regulations or what have you.
Yeah. So one example that she gives was there's physicians working with Doctors Without Borders, and they're in Uganda, and they're giving antibiotics, just the generic antibiotics, to this kid had like, it was like brain encephalitis. So like swelling in his brain from like a virus or a, no, sorry.
Well, it must have been a bacteria.
Sorry, a bacteria.
Antibacterial.
Yeah, sorry. So, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And he eventually died. And so what this one doctor that saw this was like, I don't understand. Like, why is this happening? And so he was like, obviously a newbie. And so the other doctors are like, well, yeah, that's why we bring, they call it fancy drugs. So they will bring their own drug supply from, whether they're from the States or Canada, they'll bring it with them. And then they'll have to triage patients and decide
who gets the good stuff
and who doesn't. However, this is an even more important, well, not even more important, but it's disgusting. Number one, it's absolutely disgusting. You would do this to people that are poor, and, you know.
And it's not like you can't still make money. Maybe, you know, instead of making your $4 billion profit in a year, maybe it's 3.5 or 2 or 3. Is that not enough? Like, how much do you need?
It's disgusting. But not only that, what happens is you make these less potent drugs. They still have antibiotics, but they're not able to, attack this, whatever drug it is. But then this is what's driving antibiotic resistance, is you have this low level of antibiotics that you're giving. So you're driving antibiotic resistance by only giving this low level. So it's not, I mean, obviously it's egregious and disgusting what you're doing to these countries, but then you're also setting other issues up as well.
Yep.
So
whenever you cut corners, it's like it's totally a little bit different here, but when you're raising the kids and we're trying to do something, when you do a job, do it properly the first time. Because not only are you going to have to redo it again, and you're going to waste even more time and more resources. And it's just, there's so many repercussions. And like these companies, they're not doing it. They're not doing their job right, and they're creating more problems. And I don't know, but they just don't care. It's just a quick fix for the money.
Yeah.
It's really sad. And like I said, it's unimaginable. I can't even think of why you can be a human being and think that this is good to do.
Yeah. So then to finish off the Ranbaxy story, so they get 2 of their plants eventually shut down by the FDA. They won't accept any more drugs from 2 of these plants. I don't know how many plants they have. They have a bunch of them. So
Yeah, the plant is not the problem. It's the company itself and their philosophy.
So the prosecutors float out, a couple settlements to the company, and the one main settlement is like $3 billion. It's
probably nothing.
Yeah, well, it's nothing to them. So the company, that's what the prosecutors are thinking. In the meantime, Lipitor, as I said, best-selling drug of all time, is going off patent, and Ranbaxy is the first to file generic company to make the generic version, right?
To get that 6-month window where
exclusivity.
They could be the only ones to sell the generic version.
Mm-hmm. So the FDA is humming and hawing. Do we approve this? Do we not approve this? The reason why they're humming and they know, they've gone in and they've given the factory that's manufacturing this, they've given them a bad rating. Yep. It's not right. But they're like, if we don't give them this, then they're not going to be able to pay their penalty. So if we don't give them this contract or this exclusivity, they're not going to be able to pay us.
Then shut them down.
They give them. They give them that. Yep. So they get it.
What year was this?
I'm not sure, but the ending. Well, I don't even know if it's the ending. But in 2011, they plead guilty to 7 federal criminal counts of selling adulterated drugs with intent to defraud, failing to report that its drugs didn't meet specifications, and making intentionally false statements to the government. So
the U.S. government now.
Uh-huh. So then they end up. So you heard the number I said. I said $3 billion.
Yeah.
They end up paying $500 million.
To who?
To the government, I guess.
And what did they do with that?
Fines, forfeitures, and penalties. So
the company's still going strong, I would imagine?
I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't know. I didn't have time to.
So none of this money goes to actually any of the actual victims of these.
The only person who actually got money from this was Thacker, because as part of the whistleblower laws, or how that works in the States, the whole point of blowing the whistle, you get an incentive, you get a piece of
the settlement or whatever.
Yeah. So I think he got like $28 million. He got a big chunk.
Yeah, that's not a bad day's work. Well, I mean, that's dangerous too, right?
But the thing is like, this guy is like, it destroyed his family. He ended up divorced from his wife. His family couldn't understand why he continued to fight, because obviously he first reported this to the FDA in 2004, and it didn't come to fruition or whatever until 2011. Yeah. So years and years of not knowing what's happening. Not only that, like Ranbaxy has been known to off people for speaking up about what's happening. So he's scared for his life and his family's life. But he continues to advocate for, and he's been trying to turn things around in India and trying to talk to the regulators there. So he's still it's his life's work basically.
So we're talking about getting, if you can buy name brand drugs instead of generic.
Yeah.
But not all name brand drugs, I would imagine, are produced in North America or, I'm sure they're still produced in.
But that's the point of what I'm saying is, and I think that's the point of the heparin example in here, is its brand name, but that active ingredient was made in a factory in China that wasn't inspected properly to begin with. But then the brand name company was just like, well, it shouldn't be our responsibility to check that this. So it's it should be the FDA's responsibility to investigate this plant, and then the FDA is like, no, it's your drug, so you should be the one to investigate and make sure they're following good manufacturing processes. So the buck is always passed, right? And so that's the point.
So then, even in that case, then it's even with the name brand, you still have to be careful because
80% of the active ingredients of any types of drugs are made overseas. So I think if you're a brand name, you have a higher chance of having a higher quality drug. That would be how I would feel about it. But it's still something that needs to be looked at and needs to be.
So it sounds like we should just never take drugs ever because just stay away altogether. Yeah. So the one thing that I want to ask, or that, we won't have to talk about this today because we'll be we'll go on for forever. I don't know about this. But if you look at things like the vitamin industry, or if you're I'm just going to go buy a vitamin C. Well, where does that come from?
Well,
is that a good thing?
It's not even regulated at all.
Well, there you go. So if it's not regulated, how can you trust it. Like, oh, I'm going to take this vitamin D. I'm taking this. I'm taking zinc. I'm taking magnesium.
So then,
are you?
Yeah. So then, then I would say you get what you pay for.
Well, but even if you pay for it, but still.
So I have a couple companies that I do actually trust, especially, something like
based out of Canada, US maybe.
Yep. So like the one company, actually, it's the Nutri-C, and it makes the omegas, the omega-3s and 6s, and their factory is actually here in Nova Scotia.
But you know what though? The same thing, just because their factory's here, I don't know if there's some regulations, but you don't have to disclose where you get your actual active ingredients. You could just have to disclose where it's made. So you can say, oh, produced in Canada.
Yeah.
But you could still have gotten your ingredients from anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So that's the stuff that's been going on with this whole tomato stuff. I don't know if you've been hearing what's going on.
A little bit.
Because I guess there's tomatoes coming from China.
Yeah.
That are, what are they? Just, I don't know.
I have no idea.
I don't know. They're just really bad or whatever.
I just glanced at it. I was like, oh, do we eat any of this?
But the thing is that you have the tomatoes, like, oh, it's, packaged or whatever in Canada. So you think it's Canadian, but it's actually tomatoes from somewhere else. So it's like, you don't even know where you're getting your stuff from.
Yeah.
So when I heard that, I was like, well, why are we getting tomatoes from China? Like, grow tomatoes right here.
Well,
like, what the hell?
Well, then this just goes to
does Canada not produce enough tomatoes to feed its own people?
Yeah. Well, this just goes to
global.
buy local and.
Oh yeah, it's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
Yeah.
But anyways, so. Oh.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to kind of wrap up a bit saying that it's just kind of, it's kind of tough because there's no real takeaway in terms of like what you can do, because it's like, if you need to have drugs, you need to have drugs. Like what? I
think what it goes to is that, I mean, there's a lot of things, and to be fair, we just like scratched the surface of this book. So if you're interested in reading more, she's a fantastic writer. She has a bunch of articles on Vanity Fair that are shorter, that you can also read. But I think what it goes to is that you just have to be very skeptical and not be afraid to question.
Yeah, always ask questions.
Yeah, and I think
especially your medical professionals. I think, anyways.
Yeah, yeah. So questioning, and then just knowing that just because it's like this big institution doesn't mean that it's immune to bureaucracy and corruption.
Or all the more reason that it is corrupt. The bigger things, the harder it is for them. Yeah. They always say that, like, you have this big tanker, getting it to turn takes a lot of work. Time. Yeah. Getting them to turn in terms of going from bad practice to good practice is going to take a lot of people.
Yeah.
Coming together, pointing out, asking questions, and starting to say that we're not going to accept this. This is not how we should do business.
Yeah. And I think it goes to, is it a good thing that like 80% of the active ingredients of our drugs are produced in different countries, not our country?
But the thing is, I don't even care where it's produced. I care about how it's produced. Right?
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, just because it's produced somewhere else doesn't mean it's bad. But there's the regulations and the standards that we hold might not be the same in where this other overseas place.
Well, and like that was a big thing that in this book is like there is a specific word for this type of thought process in India. I'm not saying it's just cultural differences, right? There's cultural differences everywhere, but they have an actual word for this. Is like trying to get the biggest profit for the littlest input, and it doesn't matter how you get there. Yeah, right.
And that's not even a cultural thing. That's everyone. Like, that's just how business is.
There was a specific word for it. Like, I won't get into it, but is it like, I don't know? Is this whole globalization thing a good thing? Like, we're looking at supply chain issues right now. Like, is this a good thing that so much of our manufacturing stuff is coming from other countries? Like, should we keep some stuff close by?
That's a whole other issue. Yeah,
it is a whole other issue. But I'm just,
there's so many things that have to do with it. Of course, I mean, this pandemic is kind of at the heart of everything here.
Course.
But yeah, I mean, to be able, I mean, this is what we want for ourselves. Well, I want to be able to have my house and my own garden and my own farm and create my own energy. So all the stuff that I have produced comes from me. So I don't have to be reliant on anyone else, right? But if you have a whole country that can't produce its own shit and you have to rely on other people or other countries to get your products, that is a big problem. And it's too bad because Canada is we're such a rich country where we have oil, even we have all kinds of land.
Yeah.
We have natural resources. We have all kinds of stuff that we can produce and manufacture here. I guess what we don't have is the personnel. We don't have enough people.
Yeah.
I think that's Canada's problem. We're such a small population where we don't have enough people to do the work. But still, it's because why tomatoes? Why can we not grow our own tomatoes?
Well, Leamington is like a huge, I don't know if you've been down the Leamington area near Windsor. That's where a lot of our tomatoes are produced actually down
Interesting.
there.
Yeah. Like all the potatoes are from Prince Edward Island, right across here. It's I don't need potatoes from Australia. What the hell?
Potatoes. I want my PI potatoes.
I want potatoes grown right here in Canada.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's a whole nother thing.
But I think the main takeaways are, if you have to take number one, take care of
yourself.
There are some conditions where you do just have to take medication. I understand that. Right? So number one, it's about nutting up and taking care of your health so that you can avoid as many medications as possible.
Right.
Number two, if you can, get brand. Even when I buy Tylenol or ibuprofen, I don't buy the generic version anymore, even though Tylenol and Advil are more expensive. That's what I buy now. I always buy the brand. And I think, talk to your doctor about it. Talk to your doctor about getting on brand. And then I think the last thing I'll say is, if you are on a medication and maybe there's a brand name change or something, and usually the pharmacy will tell you, even if it's a generic and they've had to change what you've been on from one generic company to another. And this does happen often because there's some times where the company is on back order, and so you can't get that specific.
You got to switch.
You have to switch generics. It happens all the time.
Yep.
Usually your pharmacist will tell you when that happens because they're required to, right? So usually they'll tell you, and they'll say, if you have any questions, like, you can just talk to the pharmacist. But if something changes, or you go from brand to generic and something
just doesn't feel right
with you, don't think it's just you. Like, question it and be like, maybe I should go back to the brand and see if it helps. Like, it's worth it. It could not just be you. Don't blame yourself.
Right. And when you're getting pumped full of drugs, if you're taking multiple drugs, then
even more so.
Who even knows how these drugs are interacting with themselves, right? And you pop in a new one, it could change your chemistry. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I just think that's really important, is just,
I think a key point too is what you said is, like, talk to your pharmacist too. I would almost recommend talking to your pharmacist over your doctor, in the sense of how your drugs are making you feel, because pharmacists 100%. Study, like, the whole point is to study drugs and how they interact in your body, where a doctor, they just study like how to fix you as a person. You know what? I don't know, whatever. What do you do in med school, right?
I think, and I could be wrong, but I think it's what drugs for what symptoms.
Yeah. Like what doctors learn. Yeah. But pharmacists, they specialize in this kind of stuff. So going back to what I was saying about going with pharmacy, playing hockey with these pharmacist students, and their whole thing was like, they there's always like this competition with doctors. They're like, doctors should not be prescribing medicines to patients because they don't have any clue of how a patient is going to respond to this particular drug. It should be like, the doctors should go to the pharmacist and say, this is the problem my patient is having. And then the pharmacists themselves should just prescribe the drugs, because they know the drugs a lot better than what doctors do.
So if you've spent any time in a pharmacy, you will know that this is 100% true, because I've said this before, the amount of times that the pharmacist has had to
go back, call the doctor, says, you cannot put this patient on this thing. Yeah.
Or the dose you suggested is actually going to kill this patient. We need to, maybe you just made a mistake or an error, but that happened one time. I think it was some sort of antibiotic for a child. And it was like,
it's like, you're not treating an elephant.
Like,
what are you doing?
No, like literally it was something like 14 times the strength that this kid needed, because it's based on weight, right?
Yeah.
And so they did it completely wrong.
Yeah.
So the pharmacist just had to call the emergency department and be like, you got this one wrong. So, but like the point is like, that was an everyday occurrence. Yeah. So 100%.
So talk to your pharmacist if you have any specific questions about your drugs and whatever. I mean, obviously it's a team. You have a team, right? You have your team. You have your doctor. I'm not saying don't talk to your doctor, right? Just your doctor and pharmacist together can.
But even like, I had an ear issue. I got water in my ear, and so I didn't go to the walk. I'm not saying don't go to the walk-in if you need to go to walk-in, but I didn't. The walk-in was closed, so I just said to the pharmacist, like, this is what happened. Can you recommend over the counter what I could get?
Right.
And she made a great recommendation, and it totally helped me in that situation. So there's they're such an untapped resource, and the pharmacists I've worked with are so friendly and so willing to help you. Like that's what they want to do. Right. Yep. So yeah, definitely talk to them.
Yep.
Yeah.
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 Anyways, now that I'm like totally depressed on all this stuff, I think that might be a good spot to end.
Yeah.
Unless you have anything else you want to add to this whole thing?
The only thing is like we talked about.
Oh God.
we went over a lot of stuff, and it goes deep into stuff. So if anyone has any questions, like just put them in the comments or message me, email me, whatever, because like this is the stuff that like I get so excited about.
For sure.
And I'm like, how many times was I like barging into your office being like, oh my God, this just blew my mind. Like, yeah. So reach out if you have any more questions. And
that's cool.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you so much for listening. And if you're out there watching, thank you for watching. And we'll see you next time. Have a good week.
Yeah. Nut up.
Or shut up.
Push people back. Late to the stage they come. Papers to blaze the punk. Police on the beats we run. High rise on an equal chunk.